the disturbing laws that are going into place into Canada, and it's coming to a country near you. Yes, it's happening in the United States, it's happening in Europe, because it's part of the G7, it's part of NATO, it's part of the UN. But let's talk about specifically what's happening in Canada. So let's dive in and see exactly what's inside these laws. So what we can see is that there's a new bill. It's called the country's Online News Act, which basically requires tech companies like Meta and Google to negotiate with and pay publishers for their news content. Now, it's sort of these are walls that start going in that start becoming checkpoints, and then they start becoming choke points. And what happened is now they're creating laws, these regulations, and so the big platforms are now blocking the news. And so now, if you're in Canada, you've probably already seen this, you can't log on to news sources. And so let's say, for example, if a Canadian person is friends with someone who lives in the United States, and the person in the United States shares a link on Facebook to, let's say, an article, well, the person in Canada won't be able to see that article. Now, that sounds like it could be a problem, obviously depending on what news it is. That this is widespread right now, they're just blocking everything. So we can see a couple of journalists in Canada have already made some comments. Anne Mary McKenzie says, "It's scary times. I'm no longer able to see the news stories." There's Meta and Google have been blocking the process. They're not able to see this. I think Tara Jeffrey says, "I think the worst part of receiving this message today was the fact that it came after we posted about a missing woman in Sarnia. It's not just the news orgs that will suffer the fallout of this. It's an entire community." So like it's hashtag local journalism matters. And so even stories like, "Hey, a missing person, can you help us?" That's blocked. Now, Meta calls this a business decision, saying it chooses to block news in order to comply with the Online News Act. Now, the company says the Canadian government based its new legislation on the incorrect premise that Meta benefits unfairly from the news content. The Minister of Canadian Heritage says that the country will stand its ground as Meta moves forward with its irresponsible message to Canada and other governments. But this is what happens when you start passing these laws. So now Meta is blocking news sharing from Canadian publishers in Canada as well. We can see that it's had a massive impact on Canadian news media, with some publishers reporting a drop in traffic of up to 70%. News publishers reporting a drop of 70%. Google's planning a similar action for local news, which it will block starting when the law takes effect no later than 180 days after the bill's June 22nd passage. Now, what does this mean for the future of news consumption in Canada? Well, it's all part of the bigger plan. It's part of the EU, UN, WEF plan, and of course Trudeau's on board for stricter control over independent news and podcasting. Now, the government regulator, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, CRTC, announced on Friday that it would require registration by independent content producers, including online news companies and individuals that host podcasts on their own websites. So now, remember I said I probably wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing in America? Well, you may not be able to do this in, I said in America, you may be able to do it in Canada. So basically, if you create content, a podcast, YouTube, whatever, you now have to go register. Now, if you know your history, you know where that leads. Registration is the first form of control. So now you have to be approved. One of my favorite lines in the book, Atlas Shrugged, which if you haven't read that book, you certainly should, is that when you have to get permission to produce from men who produce nothing. And so here you have people who have never produced anything, but you have to get permission to even produce. And so now, if you want to produce content, a podcast, a YouTube channel, now you have to go register. Well, if you have to register, that means you have to be given permission. So who do they give permission to? We saw you said something mean online before. We don't like your political affiliations or whatever, and so no registration for you, no permission for you. This is the first step. The CRTC says that the law only covers some media companies that are doing more than $10 million a year in revenue, and that the information it's demanding is just minimal. It's not a big deal, right? Right? They say that their goal is to better support Canadian indigenous content and ensure it's available. But of course, again, as we know, the registration is always just the first part. Now, we can see where this goes, and we can already see how this can be not just applied liberally, but how it can also be abused. And, of course, Trudeau and Canada have a history of abusing this. We can see in 2019, the Liberal Party released a campaign ad that falsely claimed that the Conservative Party was planning to cut health care for seniors. The ad was later removed from YouTube for violating its policies on disinformation. And so they're the ones out there peddling disinformation, which, of course, is why they need to censor the other side. Because, as I said, the truth is always found in open, honest debate. Now, what's going on right now, as I said, there's two bills. They're using two bills and a series of regulations to crack down on this free speech. So there's C-11, which is the Online News Act, and then there's C-18, which is the Online Streaming Act. So there's two different ones, the Online News Act and the Online Streaming Act. The Online News Act receives support from multiple media lobby groups, including the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and things like that. Now, as they're working their way through the legislative process, we can see that the Liberals have repeatedly lied. They've said that they were about targeting big tech and protecting and promoting Canadian culture, but in fact, they were part of a deliberate effort to censor ordinary Canadians. Now, again, if you have to register, if you have to get permission, then they're able to restrict, and it makes it harder to express yourself online. It's not hard to understand that. Now, of course, like I said, they're doing this to protect you. They're doing this to protect you from the spread of disinformation. Of course, they're not saying they're doing it to squash dissent, but they need to protect you from dangerous people using dangerous rhetoric to do things that we don't like the peaceful trucker protest. Of course, like I said, this is always the first step, and we can clearly see where this goes. We can see, back to the democracy, more than 6 in 10 Canadians are concerned about the bill's impact. Canadians are showing that, how concerned they are. They don't think big news organizations need government bailouts, and they believe that the C-18 will harm smaller outlets. And so, again, the majority is saying this. They're not listening to this. Now, it's interesting timing on this. We can see that Trudeau's crackdown comes at a time when the European Union, the United Nations, and the World Economic Forum are all demanding harsh crackdowns on free speech. So is he listening to them? Is he caving to them? Are they working in conjunction with them? Last week, the EU's top censorship officials claimed that X and Twitter was the biggest source of misinformation and demanded, yes, greater censorship. That free speech is misinformation, not us, even though we get caught lying all the time, even though if our information was true, it would win, but we need to censor that free speech because that free speech is misinformation. Well, it's opposite of what we're saying, but it doesn't make it wrong. Ahead of upcoming elections, Google, TikTok, Microsoft, and Meta also have more to do to tackle disinformation. Much of it's coming from Russia, which is using social media to wage a war of ideas against democracy, claimed the European Commissioner Vice President Vera Jourova. It's all Russia, Russia, Russia. They're the ones spreading all the disinformation. They have a massive disinformation campaign, multi-million-dollar euro weapons of mass manipulation, supposedly is what they say. They must protect us from that. The UN next month is co-sponsoring a pro-censorship event with the World Economic Forum, which of course is a private NGO, non-government organization, not elected, and they're creating a, quote, global coalition for digital safety to demand more censorship. We must stop what you can say, and we must prevent what you can hear in order to protect you and stop. We must provide censorship in order to keep you safe. The Coalition for Digital Safety. It's always for your safety. The WEF is seeking to regulate big tech companies directly and has captured big tech already. We know this. They got Google, Meta, TikTok, Microsoft all signed up for this. Twitter dropped out, of course, but the censors are relentless. Jourova said last week that Elon Musk is not off the hook, and they're coming strong.